Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Newsroom. I am Ramona Singh, and it's good to spend this time with you. We covered what's the latest on the Kuzma front, and now I want to cover on what's happening with this conflict with United States and Iran as it's going into its 60-day period of coming to an end of war deal, what we would call a peace deal on where it stands with Iran. Iran put forward its criteria in the MOU. The United States signed it, if you recall, the famous signature of President Trump 2 days earlier than announced on June 17th at the end of the G7 summit. And he signed it in France. And then you had the rotations of the news coverage of Iran's president signing it, as well as Pakistan as the mediator. And here you have the situation where then we had the eruption of things escalating again. So, despite signs of what would be a diplomatic progress between the United States as well as Iran, you have tensions that remain quite high throughout the Middle East, where you have indirect talks in Doha that have concluded with both sides agreeing to continue negotiating after what took place in the last little while between Iran and the United States. But now the latest agreement has been that they'll continue negotiating after the funeral of Iran's former supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And at the same time, Iran has issued some very strong warnings yet over the Strait of Hormuz, declaring that all commercial vessels must use Iranian designated shipping routes and warning the United States against any interference at all. If you recall, after the MOU was signed, the escalations that erupted was that the UN was essentially got involved to be able to get vessels that were trapped in the area of the Strait of Hormuz out, and they did not consult Iran. And then escalations came, and you had vessels being struck. Then the United States struck Iran, and it just escalated immediately. Iran struck, its neighboring countries across the Strait of Hormuz as a retaliation point, and then it was calm and asked that, hey, we're going to stop and we're going to go back to the table to negotiate. So Iran has been quite firm that they want to be able to control access and what they say security of vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that is a challenge because that was not the case prior to the war starting on February 28th. If you recall, Iran and the United States were in negotiations for Iran's nuclear program and so many other items after the 12-day war back in 2025. So it appeared that, things were going well. And all of a sudden, you had the escalations that took place with the bombings by Israel and United States in Iran, and that erupted into, 40 plus day massive war between the three countries. Then Lebanon became a factor because Israeli forces took over southern Lebanon to fight with Hezbollah. And then you had the ceasefire announced on April 7th, the evening of, starting on April 8th. But then there was a lot of escalations that still took place, and then some stalemate. So now it appears that they're back at the table, but the contentious issue has always been the Strait of Hormuz. And because Iran blocked off the Strait of Hormuz, we saw oil prices go through the roof, crude in the markets, but then gas at the gas pumps. And then that affected prices at the grocery stores, and inflation numbers went up because 40% of the inflation number, it comes from energy costs and grocery prices. So that was a reaction that the world saw. We saw it in Canada. We dealt with it. United States, same thing. And you have Iran that says, hey, we want to be in control and we might charge a toll. That's not in the MOU, right? That Iran can be in control of the Strait of Hormuz. It says the Strait of Hormuz is going to open. And Iran is saying, if you recall, Iran opened up its X account for the authority over the Strait of Hormuz. Military miscalculation by the United States or Israel would also be met with a decisive and swift response, and saying that they want to be the designated shipping route and for the Strait of Hormuz, that they are declaring that all commercial vessels must go through Iran and must go through the approved Iranian way through the Strait of Hormuz. And so while you have diplomacy that continues, you have military tensions still remain very high across the region. So there you have Israel that's continuing its operations in southern Lebanon despite a new US-backed framework agreement. And you have Hezbollah that's rejected the agreement and refuses to disarm in Lebanon. And there's Lebanon and Syria now have signed a non-interference agreement. And when it comes to overall airlines, they continue to suspend flights across parts of the Middle East because it's just not safe to fly over those zones. And not to mention that Europe said they're having a fuel shortage because of the months of the Strait of Hormuz being closed. So you have all of this disruption that's taking place still that is going to go on through the summer months. So there you have the current tensions that stem from this US-Iran conflict that's that we saw erupt, and we covered it and in quite detail day in day out to see what's really taking place. As we saw, the fatality numbers rise, we saw displacement numbers rise, where you have 1.3 million people in Lebanon that have been displaced. There was about 1 million people in Iran that were displaced, and those numbers keep crawling until we see what's taking place. We saw President Trump sometimes waking up to his posts on Truth Social about what he's going to do in terms of escalating the war. We covered, Defense Secretary or Secretary of War Pete Hegseth talk about what he's going to do in terms of military actions. And all of that just escalated. And even though there was a time period where we thought perhaps ceasefire really means a ceasefire, we saw escalations in the waterway. So now, when it comes to this MOU that was signed, that's binding, and it's supposed to also bind Israel to withdraw from Lebanon, which it has not done so yet. But now the MOU is aimed at ending hostilities, even though we saw the hostilities rise up for a couple of days just a few weekends ago. But majority of it is to be able to reopen trade routes because there's a lot of pressure from a lot of different countries that need oil from the Strait of Hormuz. It carries 20% of the world's supply. And you have China, India, Japan, South Korea, many different countries rely on it, as well as Europe. So now the latest technical talks that we've heard confirmed in Doha focus on implementing the agreement, also include establishing a mechanism to dissolve the disputes without having to go back into escalations, war type escalations, and discussions over the release of Iranian frozen assets. There was an agreement to release 12 billion of Iran's frozen assets during this 60-day period of negotiations. But what Doha has done is essentially break it up into first a $6 billion release, and this is a way to keep talks under the way for it to stay on track. So with Iran, it's here is $6 billion of your frozen assets returned to you. And when it comes to the United States, it's, Iran will close the Strait of Hormuz again. And so there, and you cannot send CENTCOM again, even though they're still in the area, but just to be able to redeploy and send more American troops to be able to guard that waterway and the backlash the markets have immediately to any sort of escalation. So you have that entire thing where it's keeping both sides at the table. Now, there seems to be no leverage period for Israel to be part of this entire MOU, even though they're supposed to be included. Israel has said that they will pursue their own means. Although there's been contradictory news that they have been talking with Israel and Lebanon have been discussing on how to end this. There has also been reports that Israel will withdraw from certain areas, but not completely. So this is completely evolving. And if you recall, during the height of the conflict, there was a lot of contradictory news that was coming from either side of depending on the country and depending on the source. So this is still an evolving story that we are covering in quite detail. But the main issue here is also maintaining the freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran is saying no, they're the ones in authority. So now, when it comes to several of these issues, it is continuing to threaten what could be fragile peace. I think by now, most countries are expecting that, right now it's holding, but how long will it hold for? Will they get to an end of agreement in this 60-day period that is already a countdown on? And will whatever it is that the countries agree on, will it be binding on Israel? And will they abide by it completely? It is supposed to be ratified. Like the final peace agreement is supposed to be ratified by the United Nations to be able to be binding. So this is all, that's part of making sure that this continues on track. So now Iran argues that Israel's continuing its military presence in southern Lebanon, which violates the spirit of the MOU. And then you have Israel that says it will remain until Hezbollah is no longer a threat. And then Hezbollah saying they're not going to disarm and let Lebanese army take place instead of them because they just don't trust the IDF soldiers, the Israeli defense soldiers. And so you have that entire thing where they're all saying, okay, well, I'll do it if they do it. And they're saying, we won't do it unless they do it. And that's that back and forth of what we're seeing take place in southern Lebanon between Israel, Hezbollah, and Lebanon. And then you also have Iran that's continuing to assert a much greater control over the shipping of the Strait of Hormuz and still insisting that foreign vessels follow its designated route. So before the conflict, you had about 130 to about 140 ships that transited the Strait of Hormuz each day. Now, the traffic has partially recovered. The last number was it was like at 70, and then after the massive escalation between US and Iran, it went down to like 30 and then 12. But then it's kind of almost halfway there. And so the traffic has partially recovered, but it still remains below the normal levels. And that means that insurers and shipping companies continue to be cautious and treat the waterway as a very high risk area. So now, although oil prices have also retreated, if you're seeing day by day as you pass the gas station on your way to work or dropping the kids off or wherever it is that you're going, as you see, if as you pass by the gas stations, you're seeing the numbers are coming down right day by day incrementally they are reducing even though at the height of it it just escalated like 10 cents 15 cents 20 cents very high but now we're seeing that kind of be rolled back so essentially you have that situation where the negotiations are continuing, we're seeing some sort of stability and the geopolitical risk hasn't completely disappeared and I don't think any nation thinks it has, and especially when it comes to the Middle East and what it means for those GCC countries that have been highly affected with the Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, Iraq, Bahrain. And so the situation has shifted from what we've seen, so far from the open military confrontation to what is now a managed situation to a degree. And this period of diplomacy, and we're seeing some military deterrence operate at the same time. So when it comes to the global markets, the Strait of Hormuz remains as one of the world's most important energy checkpoints, and any disruptions could essentially affect global oil, natural gas prices, fertilizer exports that go through the region, and you have immediately inflation and transportation costs go up. And what would be international shipping and supply chain issues. And then, if you recall, at the height of the conflict with US, Israel, and Iran, then you had the El Mandeb Strait also blocked in the Red Sea as a secondary route, which was very disruptive to Europe and other parts of the world. So these are things that nobody wants to see return, even though France also said that they would like to, they offered to be part in the Strait of Hormuz to be able to monitor into that. Iran rejected the offer. Where it stands, it appears that Iran is going to formalize something with Oman in the future. Now, whether that'll come after the 60-day term, whether that'll be part of the pact in the peace deal that is currently being negotiated, that is all that we're watching for. But when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, it affects Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, UAE, Qatar in terms of their exports of oil. And we saw at the height of the conflict in the war, we saw crude price go up to $120 per barrel. And prior to the conflict, it was in the low 60s, mid 70s per barrel. And we've seen the price come down to the mid 70s per barrel right now, as we're taking a look at what this all means. Now, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.